This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you very much, Don, for that nice introduction. And this afternoon, I am going to go back to Haudenosaunee territory and talk about the Three Sisters as a cropping system well known with the Iroquois. But this is a cropping system not only present here in the Northeast. It is a cropping system all over the Western Hemisphere. And as Carl Sawyer wrote in 1962, it's a symbiotic plant complex of North America without an equal elsewhere. For the Iroquois, William Fenton has indicated that it is the foundation of Iroquois subsistence, enabling them to develop institutions of sedentary life. Well, the Three Sisters, in terms of their origins in the Northeast, until quite recently, most archaeologists and anthropologists thought that these three crops arrived in the Northeast as an intact cropping system, and that they came here sometime between 1000 and 1200 BP. But recent work by the paleobotanist John Hart, who works at the New York State Museum at Albany, has put forth a much different story. First, edible squash has been around here since 3000 BP, maize by 2270 BP, and beans, a much more recent introduction, 700 BP, or just in the couple of hundred years before Europeans arrived. So Hart says that the three plants as a crop complex were not all here at the same time until around 700 BP.
Can you just mention what BP?
Oh, before present, right? So archaeologists use this. It doesn't make any sense to me because present is always changing. Why would you do that? I don't get it, but the archaeologists have a reason for it, and I'm trying to be a good archaeologist someday, so I use what they use, right? Well, the Three Sisters in Iroquois, or in Haudenosaunee areas, territories, have been central to our cultural identity in our oral texts, such as the creation story, in the words that come before all else, in all aspects of social and political institutions, and in subsistence. And of course, women were the farmers in Iroquois, and women controlled most aspects of agricultural work. In the top right, you see a watercolor painting by Ernie Smith, a Seneca artist in the 1930s, portraying a very typical Iroquoian view of the plants. They're portrayed as members of a family, as women, and the difference between the plant and the human beings is not discernible, right? They're one. We also see another painting below by Ernie Smith, showing, this one was called Corn Gatherers. Another one of his paintings showing women bringing corn in from the field. And the drawing on the left was by a Jesuit up in the 1600s who was along the St. Lawrence with Iroquoian villages and farmers up there. And this was one of the drawings that he made of women working in the field with handheld hoes. In terms of the agronomic characteristics of the Three Sisters, they're typically planted on mounds, and this is you see there is a photo from early 1900s in western Massachusetts, and this was thought to be an old Indian planting field. The crops were usually planted as a polyculture, but not always. There are indications that there were sometimes corn monocultures or bean monocultures, and sometimes I think even pumpkin monocultures. There were no plows in this cropping system. It was hand tools only. It was continuously cropped, meaning this was a permanent agriculture, not shifting cultivation. And the primary reason for that is where most of this agriculture was taking place, which is along the center of New York State, present-day New York State, and this is a band of alpha sols, which are highly fertile. This is where most of our best agriculture is even now. So the continuously cropped means that these were on very highly productive, fertile soils. When we think about shifting cultivation, that is a management strategy for acid in fertile soils, and so not applicable here at this time. In terms of the agricultural productivity of this system, historic records provide a very extensive record of firsthand observations that date all the way back into the 1680s, even earlier, indicating that Iroquois agriculture was highly productive. People were amazed at the types of crops that they were seeing, but no one took any yields. So we have no measures of corn, bushels of corn per acre, which as an agricultural scientist, that's what I'm always interested in. So back in the middle 1990s, decided to do some field research and to get some numbers. So we carried out some experiments at the Musgrave Research Farm up in Cayuga County and on a private farm in Tompkins County. And as much as we could, we used crop varieties and agronomic practices similar to what the Iroquois would have used in the 17th and 18th centuries. I'm going to show you some quick crop yields. This was at Tompkins County, averaged over 2 years. And these are the three sisters, meaning the, wrong way. No, not liking that. Okay. So these are the three sisters, the crops: corn, beans, and squash, corn in green, bean in orange, and pumpkin yellow. Corn by itself, bean by itself, and pumpkin by itself. So that's what happened in Tompkins County over 2 years. In Cayuga County, it looked quite a bit different. The three sisters, almost no corn, almost no beans or pumpkin, higher yields. The corn monoculture, about the same. Bean monoculture, pretty dreadful. And pumpkin monoculture, equally dreadful. All right. What agronomists do, one of the problems with yields like this, trying to compare pumpkins with corn, is you can't do it. It really doesn't make any sense. So what agronomists do, we use something called land equivalency ratios. And what we do is we simply look at the ratio of each one of the crops in the polyculture and compare it to when it was grown in monoculture. So for example, the corn yield in Tompkins County in 1993 was 1874 in the Three Sisters and 2231 when it was grown as a monoculture, meaning that we basically got 82% of the yield in the Three Sisters compared to when it was grown as a monoculture. We go down and do the same thing for beans, 132 in the Three Sisters versus 1096. We only got 12% of the yield. If we look at the pumpkins, 14,465 to over 40,000, we got about a third. What we do is we add up those ratios and we get a number, 1.3. That's the land equivalency ratio. And anytime the number is over 1, what intercropping people say is that it was an advantage to have planted it as a polyculture. If the number is less than 1, it says you should have stuck with monocultures, right? So we can look at Tompkins 1994, 1.08, Cayuga 1997, 1.16. Much of the polyculture intercropping literature will show results like this, although sometimes the yields are less. We get LERs less than 1. But in this particular examples, they're all over 1. All right, I've just been talking about crop yields, and the title is, what did they eat, right? So I'm interested in food values, and I'm focusing on two things, energy and protein. And the reason for this is that subsistence farmers will first ensure that they can actually feed their families, that their families won't starve. And so what they do is they look to produce energy. Their next priority, after they're making sure people aren't starving, is to increase the quality of the diet by adding protein. So as a consequence of this, most subsistence farmers will plant a grain like wheat, maize, rice for energy, calories, and a legume like bean, pea, or lentils in order to add protein. But I'm back to this question again, because before we go any further, we have to be clear about what we're talking about here. What did they really eat? Now, I've given lots and lots of workshops to little fourth graders all around Tompkins County with my kids and then with lots of other people's kids, right? And almost every time after we do a workshop on the Three Sisters, some little kid will come up and grab my arm and say, but what did they really eat? Because they're thinking corn, sweet corn, and green beans, and pumpkins. And it's hard to imagine making a real meal out of that. So always the question, what did they really eat? Well, it is confusing because corn, we can harvest it when it's immature, green. You notice the stalks are green, the husks are green, and if you pull back the husk, that kernel is going, if you pinch it, it will squirt milk into your eye. And we call this sweet corn, right? So that's one way, corn, zea mays. But we also have zea mays that looks like this. And this is mature corn, right? Notice it's brown. The stems are brown, the leaves are brown. Notice the ears, the husks are brown. And notice how different the kernels look, right? They're hard. This is grain corn, right? We can do the same thing for beans. This is Phaseolus vulgaris, a kidney bean. We can harvest it when it's immature, green. The leaves are green, the pods are green. Slice open the pod, right? We see a little tiny seed in there, but we're eating that whole pod. But we could leave the plant in the field, let it fully mature. Notice everything's turning brown. Now we harvest a pod, but we take out the seeds inside there and we eat those. No longer interested in that pod. Well, this has major effects on the nutrient content of these foods. So for example, if we harvest maize as sweet corn, 75% of it is water. It has 86 calories and 3 grams of protein. But if we wait and harvest it as mature grain, it's only 10% water, 3,650 calories, and 9 grams of protein. What happens with green bean is even more striking. Harvest it when it's green, 90% water, 31 calories, 2 grams of protein. Wait until it's mature, we call it a kidney bean, 12% water, 3,370 calories, and 30 grams of protein. So you can guess, if you're a subsistence farmer, when you're going to harvest your crops. Predominantly, particularly if you're worried, right, maybe you don't have enough, you're going to be harvesting mature grain and mature beans. So corn grain and dried beans. All right, but now we want to go from a crop yield to a food yield. And it turns out this is a fairly complicated process. It's not so easy. So I'm bringing back this data from the field experiments, but now I've averaged over sites and over years. And we're looking at crop weights, at harvest weights, not dry weights, more or less at harvest weights. And the maize is at 10% water, the beans at 12%, pumpkin flesh at 90, pumpkin seed at 5. Notice here now I've divided the pumpkin into the flesh and the seed. So now if we look at these crop weights at harvest, we see the three sisters. These are just weights over the years. But look at this pumpkin, right? I mean, if you're just thinking about weight, you'd say, well, we should just go with the pumpkins. There's more of that than anything else. But the problem is that most of that pumpkin is water. And water has neither calories nor protein. So if we're interested in its food value, we've got to figure out a way to get rid of the water and compare it more fairly. So we convert the harvest weight to energy and protein. And the ways that we do this is we look at the USDA nutritional database, which gives us the amount of calories in maize. This is when it has 10% water. So we've got maize, 3650 calories per kilogram and 94 grams of protein per kilogram. Bean, very similar to maize, but a lot more protein, about the same amount of water. Pumpkin flesh, only 260 calories, 10 grams of protein, and an awful lot of water, right? Pumpkin seed, whoa, 5,590 calories, 302 grams of protein, and only 5 of water. Well, now we're beginning to see some differences in how we might begin to compare these different systems. So in this graph, what I'm showing is the three sisters here, and this is the total calories coming from maize, the bean, pumpkin seed, and pumpkin flesh. And notice the amount of energy there. It's actually more than what we get from maize monoculture. It's way more than we get from bean monoculture, and it's a lot more than what we get from pumpkin. But note also that a huge amount of the pumpkin calories is coming from the seed, right? Now you might want to remember the land equivalency ratio and how that, even with just the weights, showed us that even with the three sisters, we got an LER of slightly over 1 compared to the corn monoculture, right? So we know that we can do better, and the energy reflects that. I just brought this up to show you and remind you again, right? We'll go on. We can do the same thing with protein, right? So this one, we're looking at protein in the three sisters, in maize monoculture, in bean monoculture, and in pumpkin monoculture, right? And notice the significant contribution from the beans and the pumpkin, both flesh and seeds. And notice that it is now quite a bit higher than maize monoculture, and still higher than the bean, and still higher than pumpkin. But many of you are saying, but wait a minute, plant proteins are incomplete. So those, how can you really be measuring the proteins? Because we know that plants don't provide all of the essential amino acids that we need, right? So they have different amounts. And that is absolutely true. Let's look at the maize, the bean, the pumpkin seed, and I've put pumpkin flesh up here too. These are the essential amino acids, and what we will notice is that 4 of these, isoleucine, lysine, 309, and tryptophan, corn in particular is low in these, and bean nicely complements where the maize is low, and surprisingly, the pumpkin seeds are really strong in some of those areas as well. You're probably asking, but these numbers on the pumpkin flesh, they're so small, why do you even include them? Well, there's a lot of pumpkin flesh. And when you add up all of those amino acids, they can complement the amino acids in the other plant foods or from other foods, whether it's fish or nuts or deer. They can be part of the protein contribution even though the concentration is so small. I was also interested in looking at calcium, vitamins A and C, and niacin. And these, again, are taken from the USDA nutrient database. What we see down at the bottom is a recommended daily allowance. So, for example, for calcium, we need 1,000. And when we look here, we see, oh, we're not looking so good, right? Not very good numbers here for any of these foods. If we look at vitamin A, oh, maize and beans are dreadful, but pumpkin flesh, whoa, we need 5,000, and we get 8,500 in 100 milligrams. Vitamin A is not going to be a problem, right? Vitamin C, however, we need 60, and we're pretty low, right? And niacin, we need 15, and this doesn't look so great either, right? We'll come back and talk a little bit more about this. This wonderful word, nixtamalization. It's a word that means it's a way of preparing corn grain, that it is soaked and usually cooked in an alkaline water, a solution. In Iroquois, we cook it in hardwood ash, right? Nixtamalization does a number of really neat things. The very first thing is it dramatically reduces cooking time because the alkaline solution attacks the pericarp of maize, which is very, very hard, and it begins to hydrolyze it so that water can get in much more quickly, and so it dramatically reduces cooking time. But the other thing that nixtamalization does, all of those ashes have lots of calcium, and what happens is the calcium gets attracted to maize starch grains, and so the calcium content of the corn or the maize increases 100 to 400%. The nixtamalization also improves protein quality, and it does this. Remember the amino acids, and I showed you a bunch of them that corn was really deficient in. That's lysine, tryptophan, histidine, methionine, and threonine. So it increases the relative amounts of these amino acids, so the end result is it makes corn a higher quality protein, meaning it doesn't have, yes?
Do you know if when nixtamalization is done with lime, as is typically done by the indigenous people in Mexico and Central America, whether it has the same impact on calcium content?
Exactly the same, yes. Exactly the same. It's just a difference in what you're doing, what you're using to make the alkaline, solution. So, so when we nixtamalize corn, we actually improve its protein quality because we balance out some of or we increase the amounts of some of those amino acids which are very low. But it also has another impact in that it increases niacin, which is part of the vitamin B complex, preventing pellagra. Pellagra is a really ugly, terrible disease that was rampant in the southeastern U.S. in the early 1900s. It is still widespread in parts of Africa and Asia, and it comes from primarily a diet that is almost exclusively corn. And the problem with the corn is that it's low in tryptophan, and tryptophan is a precursor to forming niacin, right? So when you nixtamalize, you increase the tryptophan, and that increases the niacin, right? Before colonization, there was not a single documented case of pellagra in the Western Hemisphere. It was only after that pellagra came, and much of it has to do with the process of nixtamalization, because when the poor folks in the southeast United States were eating corn, they were mostly just grinding it and not nixtamalizing it first. And they were so poor, they had no beans either. And the same thing is true in parts of Africa and Asia. This is a disease of poor people who do not have the technology, the nixtamalization, or any kind of legume in order to increase the quality. All right, so we've talked about all these comparisons, and I've told you how wonderful the Three Sisters is compared to monocultures of maize and bean and pumpkin. Although I'm sure many of you are noting, this maize monoculture, in both energy and protein, maize is amazing, right? It really is hard to beat. Maize out-yields every other grain crop. It is just pretty spectacular, as Margaret Smith here is nodding away. But so I've been comparing the Three Sisters with a maize monoculture, a bean monoculture, and a pumpkin monoculture. And what I am implying is Iroquois farmers would choose to plant the Three Sisters, or no, we're not going to plant our field to the Three Sisters this year, we're going to plant a bean monoculture. There's no way that would happen. It's not a choice between planting your field to the Three Sisters or deciding just to plant pumpkin. I mean, they know that's not going to work, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right? You're not going to decide between 3 crops and 1 crop for your entire field, right? Rather, you're going to take your field, and I couldn't make this into a square, right? So pretend that the field is a circle, right? So instead of planting the Three Sisters, we might decide to plant 1/3 of the field to corn, 1/3 to beans, and 1/3 to pumpkin, right? So instead of having the Three Sisters over the entire field, we divide it into 3 parts and put 1 crop here, but it's still on the same field, right? It's still, let's say, 1 hectare, right? So 1/3 of the hectare is corn, 1/3 is bean, 1/3 is squash, right? Or we could decide, seeing how productive the corn is, I'm going to put half of it, half of the field into corn, and I'm going to put 25% into bean and 25% into pumpkin. Or I really say, boy, that corn is looking awfully good. I'm going to put 80% of the corn of the field into corn and only 10% into bean and pumpkin, right? This is a much more realistic comparison of what people would actually choose, the decisions that farmers are making. So now let's look at monoculture mixtures versus the Three Sisters. So this first one, and we're looking at energy. So this first one says we've got 1/3, right? We've got 1/3 of these crops, and this is how much each one of these, the maize, bean, and pumpkin, contribute to the total energy, right? It's looking not so great, right? If we look at the one that's 50% corn and then 10%, 25 and 25 bean and pumpkin, we can see we're doing better, but it's still not great. When we put 80% into corn, we're doing better. If we plant the whole field to corn, we're even better, right? Forget the pumpkin and the squash and the beans, right? Just plant corn. But now look at the Three Sisters, right? When we plant the corn and we add the bean and pumpkin, we get a jump in the amount of energy. That's the land equivalency ratio that we saw in the yield as well, but we see it in energy too, right? We see that, yeah, there's a good reason why these farmers are planting the Three Sisters, because it turns out that we get more energy from this than anything else. We can look at the same thing in terms of protein, but it looks different, right? First of all, we look at the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and we can see we're getting about 1/3 from maize, a little bit more than a 1/3 from the pumpkin, and something less than that from the beans. But the total amount is still less than what we get from the Three Sisters. And every time we increase the amount of corn, we increase the amount of protein, right? It goes up, and we get right up to there when we go all corn, but notice the significant impact of the Three Sisters on increasing protein. Now, I would argue that this is the major advantage of the Three Sisters. Not so much in terms of energy. It does give extra energy, but it's really the protein. So all of these are on the same piece of land, right? And we've just varied whether it's Three Sisters or the others. Mario.
And what's the mixture of the Three Sisters?
This one, oh, the mixture? I mean, these are all, this is, it's the standard thing, right? When you're asking what portion of this, most of the yield is coming from the corn, whether it's protein or energy. But the fact is that this is on one piece of land. So exactly where it comes from doesn't matter, right? I mean, you plant 3 kernels of corn in a hill and 2 or 3 of beans, and you plant the pumpkin in between. What you're interested in is what comes out, right? Of what the yield is in terms of energy and protein, right? All right. One last question that I'm interested in is, well, how many people? And I'll tell you how I got started on this. I got called by the Museum of the American Indian in New York City, the National Museum, but not the one in Washington. It's other site in New York City. And they're doing a program, educational program on the Three Sisters, and they wanted to have a cropping game in which young kids and their families would plant different amounts, either as polycultures of the Three Sisters or as monocultures. And they wanted to make it real, and they said, well, how many people could it feed? You know, like an acre of the Three Sisters, right? And I said, oh, well, I'll have to do some calculations. And I did some quick back of the envelope calculations, and I realized it was a very interesting question about how many people could actually eat off of a hectare of the Three Sisters, right? And so in order to make this kind of calculation, you first have to determine, well, what are the daily requirements of an active adult for energy? In other words, how many calories do we need? And what about protein? So on a daily basis, 2,500 calories per day is pretty realistic. 60 grams of protein, realistic. You just multiply by 365 and you come up with what one person would need for a year, close to 1 million calories, right? To provide basics, and 22 kilograms of protein, right? And then I just go back to the data that I just showed you and kind of divide it out. So people supported by monoculture mixtures, the ones I was showing you before, and the Three Sisters. In this case, the energy is in the lighter kind of tan, and the protein is in the darker color. And what we see is that on everything in a third, we're able to feed probably 7 people per hectare in terms of energy, supply that. In terms of protein, we get over 10, right? Notice that as each time the corn goes up, each of these numbers increases. So we're up to, with the monoculture of corn, we're up to about 12.5 people fed per hectare in terms of energy, and about 13.5 in terms of protein. But once again, the Three Sisters. In terms of energy, we could supply for about 13 people, and in terms of protein, about 15.5. Just for comparison, to think about it, and I have these figures and could actually do it, but I didn't think I would have time today. If we looked at European wheat growers in the same time period, wheat farmers in Europe were struggling to feed even 3 or 4 people per hectare, right? And so what we see here is a cropping system that is multiple times more productive and able to support more people. All right, so what are the conclusions here? First, that intercropped maize, bean, and pumpkin is highly productive, and it certainly could have been counted on to largely satisfy Haudenosaunee dietary needs. There are no indication that they used only these crops. In fact, many other sources of food in this area. Very, very productive ecosystem with all sorts of other plants, wild plants, lots of animals and fish, but certainly as the foundation for their diet, it was doing a great job. One of the reasons for this is maize. It is the anchor of the system, and with its very high crop yields, it produces really enormous amounts of energy and a lot of protein. The Three Sisters, as a cropping system, provides more energy and protein than individual crop monocultures and more than monoculture mixtures of these three crops. The bean and pumpkin seeds increase the total amounts of protein and improve protein quality. The pumpkin flesh provides lots of vitamin A, and maize nixtamalization decreases cooking time, increases calcium 100 to 400%, improves protein quality, and increases niacin, preventing pellagra. If we're looking at how many people we can support, Three Sisters, and I have to qualify this. These are based on yields from field experiments, right? And the amounts, the maize yields, I am absolutely confident in. These are very realistic maize yields in either the polyculture or when planted as a monoculture. These are very realistic yields. The beans and the pumpkin, much less experience in only a couple of sites and years. So I have much less confidence in the beans and pumpkin, but it's pretty clear to me that even with relatively small amounts, small yields of beans and pumpkin, the Three Sisters does a great job, because even those small amounts boost things enough to significantly increase energy and protein. So in terms of energy, enough for 13.4 people per hectare per year, and in terms of protein, almost 16 people per hectare per year. So with that, I'm open to questions.
The explanation for the over-yielding, mostly the nitrogen from the beans, or not?
No, I mean, I would say that the contribution of beans in terms of nitrogen to the cropping system is very minor. And the reason for that is that people eat the beans, which are what contains most of the nitrogen. There are small amounts of nitrogen in the stems and leaves, but the majority of the nitrogen in the bean is in the bean, right? And once you eat it, the only way it gets back onto the field is if you put human waste back on the field, like we do with cows, right? So the bean contribution is relatively unimportant. I think the reason for the increased productivity, at least what literature on intercropping tells us, is it's just increased efficiency of the entire system. In other words, the three crops are collecting more sunlight and more energy. They're gathering more water. Their roots are gathering more water and nutrients underneath. And as a result of that, we're seeing small efficiencies that result in somewhat greater yield.
Can you say anything about how these foods were prepared and eaten in terms of tortillas? And I know lots of different indigenous
Not tortillas.
practices.
The corn and beans primarily in soup and in bread. The person to look for that, two major sources. One is Arthur Parker, Iroquois uses of maize and other food crops, and his contemporary Waugh, W-A-U-G-H, and I think it's just called Iroquois Foods. And both of those were written in the early 1900s and give very extensive descriptions of them.
Jane, the cucurbit that you spoke about was pumpkin. Was that the sole cucurbit type that the Haudenosaunee used?
No, there was indications, particularly at the time of Sullivan's campaign, that there were lots of different types of cucurbits, and cucurbits are a bit of a nightmare in terms of their complexity, and I barely feel competent to even say. What I know is that the one that I am looking at and the nutrient data that I've taken from is Cucurbita pepo. Margaret's saying, you got it right, you got it right. So, and those are crops that have brightly colored flesh, quite firm, right? So it looks like a pumpkin or what we would often think of as a winter squash, but the acorn is in a different place, right? Even though acorn we think of as a winter squash, the acorn is not pepo. It's pepo ova, I think, or something like that. Anyways, but there were other cucurbits that were much more similar to like melons and things, maybe even cucumbers that the English might have known about because they seemed to, during Sullivan's campaign, kind of give them names that sounded like, so they might have been growing lots of other things too, right? But I focused for the food value on the pumpkin or the winter squash because it is the most nutrient dense.
Yeah.
In the process of nixtamalization, I'd expect some nutrients to be lost in the solution, but they're also picking up calcium. Do you have any information of
Well, the
the
one thing
changes?
about nixtamalization that I did learn, which surprised me, was that the total protein actually decreases on the corn. The total amount of protein of nixtamalized corn is less than unnixtamalized. But the reason, and I think some of that I'm not even sure how that happens, but the protein quality increases substantially, right? So that more than compensates, right? In terms of other things that might be lost in terms of leaching, I didn't see anything. And I've read a number of papers on nixtamalization, and I don't recall them saying that things were lost other than protein went down, total protein.
I know that Tay maize originates in Central America. Do squash and beans also come from Central America?
Yes, short answer, yes. Although squash was domesticated at 2 different times. In the eastern woodlands in North America, and in Central and South America. But the first squashes that were domesticated were inedible gourds. And so then there is as far as I understand, the edible, squash comes in quite a bit later, right? But again, I'm not sure of that. The edible squash may have been only domesticated in Central America and then moved forward, because what was domesticated in the eastern woodlands was an inedible gourd. Right?
And second part of the question, do you see the Three Sisters elsewhere, like as in Mexico with the Aztecs?
Absolutely. As Carl Sawyer said, it's across the entire Western Hemisphere, at least up into kind of southern Canada, and goes all the way down. I'm not sure, probably not Peru?
Yes.
Yes, Peru too? Okay. So it's all over. Sometimes they only use 2, right? But most of the time there are 3.
With the Three Sisters being grown in the same place year after year, did that system require fertility additions of any kind?
This is a great question, and I will send you an article on this. It says, yes, I mean, they were not grown indefinitely because Iroquois villages were moved frequently. It used to be the standard kind of rationale given was that the soils became depleted. That's not true. The soils did not become depleted, primarily because the Iroquois did not use plows. And they were starting on very fertile soils, alpha soils. The major loss of fertility in agricultural systems is not from crop uptake. It's from plowing, which causes oxidation of nitrates And most of those nitrates leave the soil system, only a few are captured by the crop. When you plow continuously, which Europeans and US settlers did for a couple of hundred years, you will see a dramatic decline in soil fertility. It had always been assumed that the reason for that was these crops were just grabbing out all of that nitrogen. But that's not true. The major reason for the decline in fertility was the continuous plowing. So the fact that the Iroquois were growing crops, starting with very fertile soils, alpha salts typically will have unplowed 4 to 5% nitrogen. If you don't plow them, the only thing that you are losing then is what's taken up by the crop. Small amounts when you're digging out there with your hoe don't get captured by the roots, but the decrease in soil organic matter and in nitrogen is very, very small, right? So from what we can see, the Iroquois were not cutting down trees and looking for new fields every year. Once they had cleared a field and formed those mounds, they probably stayed there for as long as the village stayed. And the village moved not because of soil fertility decline, but because of trade needs, of defensive needs, of the longhouse was infested with fleas, right? I mean, whatever. They had reasons to move, but it had nothing to do with declining soil fertility.
What about like insects and diseases? Were they all brought by Europeans, or were there any of the major insect diseases like?
I mean,
maybe
certainly
beetles?
European
Yeah,
corn
the-
rootworm,
yeah,
and
right.
a few
The
others were
beetles,
brought.
like the squash bug or any other diseases?
No, I'm sure that they had, diseases.
So that would be maybe a reason for one to know their craft?
I mean, my guess is that the squash bugs will accumulate wherever the squash is, and they don't have a hard time finding it. I mean, the thing that I would think would be the biggest pest would be weeds, right? And the weeds, we could never grow the Three Sisters at the Musgrave Farm or any place else without doing an awful lot of hand weeding. Two reasons for this. One is because we're using plows, and so when you use plows, you're constantly bringing up the weed seeds and encouraging weeds to germinate. And second, a lot of the weeds that are most troublesome now in New York State are imports from Europe. Right. So we're out of time.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
Jane, for coming.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.